Welcome to Running Fundamentals Part 3. I'm Graham Tuttle, the Barefoot Sprinter. Today we're going to talk about pain. Now, sometimes when things hurt, you might find yourself on the bleachers. But to keep yourself off the bleachers for too long, it's important to know the difference between the little irritations and the big problems. But just like any issue with running, if you don't pay attention to it when it's a small blister, it turns into a big issue over time. So most issues happen in running because it's the same thing over and over and over again. Unlike other sports where you can kind of work around it, if something happens that causes pain from running, that will continue to get exacerbated every single step for tens or hundreds of thousands of steps. So it's really important to build a foundation so you can preempt a lot of the issues on the front end, but also know what's happening and know how to address the small stuff when it first pops up. Because if you don't nip it in the bud, it will become a long-term issue. And that's the difference between having something that's just a short-term inconvenience versus something that wrecks your running career long-term. No one ever starts off thinking that that little bit of plantar fasciitis is going to ultimately keep them from running again, or the Achilles tendonitis, or the shin splints, or the patellar tendonitis, or the turf toe, or the big toe arthritis. Those things start off small, but they add up to big things over time. The most important thing to understand is that if you're in pain, it's almost a guarantee that you're not strong enough. When we don't have the strength to support our running form over the distance or the pace, we end up compensating. That means we end up heel striking, we end up overstriding, or we end up collapsing in either at the ankle or the knee or the hip. And that causes impingement and that causes irritation at the joint. So the way you fix that is by prioritizing your form by working on speed work, prioritizing your strength by working on your weightlifting and your overall mobility, and then prioritizing the rest and recovery, meaning we have to build up and adapt to the tissue demand of a volume or an intensity over time. After strength, the most likely indicator of injury is you don't have enough mobility, meaning you don't have enough requisite range of motion in your tissue. So what you have to understand is that running in a sedentary, stiff range of motion is kind of like being stuck on a couch. You might be moving some part of your body, but you're in the same position. You're making the same movements over and over and over again. A lot of people go into running because it's something that's accessible for them. They have shoes, they have just can get outside in the running pants, and then they go and run. But they don't think about switching that up, and they lose the requisite mobility. They can't sit on the ground, they can't get off the ground, they can't touch their toes, they can't move their feet, they can't flex their knees or the hips fully, they lose rotation of the hips, and these things create stiffness in the tissue. You have to think of your body like a sponge. If you don't have access to move all the tissue and to squeeze the water out, the sponge gets stale. And you end up in a situation where instead of being able to have a pliable, healthy, vibrant fascial suit, you end up getting stuck and stiff. You can imagine wearing a full suit that gets stiff in one area. If I took a big handful of cloth, it would prevent the overall suit from moving correctly. And so your body responds to motion and movement. And if I'm not pushing and pulling the tissue and creating this traction and pulling stimulus on your tissue, I'm not hydrating it. And then it gets dehydrated and it gets stuck. And that creates long-term deficits in your ability to keep healthy tissue. That irritated, dried out, dehydrated tissue ends up creating the joints that no longer move. That creates the itises of the tendonitis where the connective tissue, the tendons, the ligaments that surround the wrap a joint are no longer stretchy. And then it starts to creak and then your body feels stuck. So if you're not mobile enough, you end up losing the hydration for your entire fascial suit. The biggest likelihood is if you're running a lot, you're not diverse enough in your movement, meaning you need to think of running as one part of the overall movement recipe. There's a context of running, which is typically you'd be running and changing direction, changing elevation, stepping left and right, stepping over objects, or slowing down and moving in different directions. That's the diversity of movement. If you lack the diversity of movement because you're just running on the same two-dimensional, pristine, flat surface and just going in one direction, or you're stuck on a treadmill, you end up in this place where your brain and your body stops getting the movement stimulus it needs to stay healthy, which is why it's so important to think about multi-directional movement, playing sports, jumping, changing directions, running at different paces, doing hill sprints, going down hills, jumping over things in a like a track or an agility-like manner. There's so much variety to stuff. So as part of the running warm-up, if you can add in things like A-skips, lateral skips, movements in different directions, it's important to keep your body and your brain smart. Because if you only do one thing over and over and over again, you lose the diversity that keeps you young, playful, and healthy. And before we move on, it's important to touch on all the common symptom treatments that people go to, specifically orthotics. Most people at the first line of discomfort, they go straight to a podiatrist or a doctor and ask, hey, my foot hurts, my ankle hurts, what should I do? And you go to a podiatrist, their first line of defense is to put you in an orthotic. Now, that does not mean that there's not value in orthotics or that there isn't a use case for them, but you have to realize that these are not long-term supports. These are not long-term problem solutions. They're just symptom treatments. Essentially, what an orthotic does is it stabilizes your foot. It keeps it from moving. If you stabilize your foot, you might shut off the pain symptom because you're not irritating the same tissue, but you will ultimately make that worse because you are decreasing the strength of the foot and decreasing the hydration of the tissue at the foot, and you're increasing the leverage of the amount of force that you have to put at the ankle or the knee or the end of the foot, because the foot is no longer bending as a unit. So remember, if you go to an orthotic, if you go to a doctor and they put you in an orthotic as the first line of defense, it is not a good solution, because you have to have an egress method to get out of it. You need to have a plan. An orthotic can be part of a plan. It can be a time where if you have a very severe, painful stimulus and you need to stabilize your foot, or let's say you've broken some part of your foot, you can use an orthotic in a very short-term stint to be able to build off of that. But if you don't have a plan to get movement back and strength to your feet, you will ultimately end up worse off. For people that go in, and I see it all the time, a 60, 70-year-old podiatrist will put an 8-year-old kid in an orthotic without any plan to get out of it, and then that ends up in a lifelong death sentence for the foot. If you put in an orthotic, it is a straight line from that to knee injuries, to continued knee pain, and to prolonged and more severe foot injuries. So remember, braces, support shoes, orthotics, those all treat symptoms. Anything that takes away the mobility of your foot ultimately weakens your system. Your foot doesn't need the support, it is the support. And if you forget that, you end up using extraneous methods to try and create that. Pain is a signal that something is not right. You're either not strong enough, you're not mobile enough, you're not moving diversely enough. And if you ignore that and just use symptom treatment and pain pills and ice and inflammatories and orthotics and braces, you will end up making that worse, and that will wreck your running career. But if you start and pay attention to the small pains as soon as they pop up, and you build off the foundation, and remember the first checklist, first, be able to move your feet, second, be able to jump, third, have the strength to be able to maintain the appropriate running form. Then you work on shoes that continue to let your feet be feet, none of this pronation control support, none of the stiffness stuff, none of the anti-roll bar, and that allows your feet to build a strong foundation. And that is the ultimate solution to get out of pain. You might have to step back, you might have to scratch a different itch, but that's why it's valuable to have cycling or swimming or some type of paddling, something that's going to scratch the itch for you outside of running. But if you don't have enough diversity in your life and you only have running to scratch the itch, you'll continue to exacerbate the pain. Remember, there's a context to this. You will get through the pain, you'll move past it. But if you don't nip this in the bud right off the bat, it will get worse, it will snowball, and you will end up in a much worse situation. Which ultimately brings us to part 4 of our series, talking about strength training for running. And we're going to cover that next. But remember, if you're in pain right now and you don't have guidance on where to go, I have support for you. I've been there. I've had so many foot issues and I've helped so many people get out of it. It's an athletic foundation program will get you a fresh start and get your feet healthy so you can build off that for any type of running you want. That is in the links below or somewhere associated with this video. Get on that, start for free, you can make a huge difference. And once you start to get that foundation of pain-free movement underneath you, then we can go to part 4 and start talking about strength training. That's next.